primer on using type. Again, over here, we've got our tool palette, and right there is the type tool. Got that little colored in corner there, which tells us that there's more information there. If we click on it, we'll see that we have the type tool, the type on a path tool, and vertical type tool. So you can just start with your basic type tool for now and just go out into the workspace and click, and you'll get automatically the Greek text here. And it's already highlighted, so I can go ahead and type in the information I want to put in there. You'll notice over here we've got your basic type palette already. You can also go to Command T and we'll pull up your type palette. Here it is as well. Different ways you can affect that type. Right now I've got it selected with my general select tool, and I can go in and change the font. It's really handy because right now you can start to see what that type that you've got, the word that you've got selected, you can see what it will look like in the different fonts, right? So that's pretty cool right there, to be able to do that. Also, you can change the scale of it, the point size of it. You'll notice that this is set on right now auto. This is the leading, which is a type of the measurement between baselines here. Typically, and this is something that computers do, they do things like 0.2. It's based on an algorithm for whatever this size is. It comes up with an algorithm for what this size should be. That's what the computer does. What humans do is they use whole numbers. So I would probably, if this was 36 points, I might go to putting this at say, perhaps a 40-point leading or something like that. This is the kerning, which is again set on auto. Right now, what happens is these letter forms in most fonts come with what called kerning pairs, which means that a capital T is given X amount of space when it was next to a lowercase y, or if it was next to a capital Y, it would be maybe a different space. These kerning pairs define how that looks, and typically it will look pretty good coming straight out of the computer, but you can continue to go in and adjust that by changing the space. You'd have to put your cursor in. I'm going to double click here to put my cursor there. And you can see how I can go and change the space between those things just by manipulating this, right? Um, a kind of an easy way to do that without going into the kerning palette is you just hold down the Option key and use your arrows. You might note that this goes in increments of 20 when you do that. So that might be a good way to kind of set it up initially and then do additional refinements by going in and manipulating the kerning in the kerning palette here. This is tracking. It's similar to kerning, but it does it over a series of letter forms. So what we would do is select the letter forms we want to do that to, and you can see how it's stretching out that whole set there. Tracking is really useful, especially when you're dealing with columns of type and you want to kind of adjust that in order to make things fit really well. Additionally, we have things like the scaling for the vertical and horizontal. Tell you what, this is just a bad idea. um, there are all kinds of good reasons to manipulate type, but just doing it with using the horizontal and vertical scale here is really not very successful. It looks bad. It's typically really shows that somebody is an amateur when they're dealing with type. there are other ways to manipulate the type that we'll get into without doing that. What happens is because the type is been designed by a type designer, a typographer, to have very specific proportions. And as you start to change those proportions, what's happening here is that these proportions are getting taller, but this proportion is also getting taller, but this is not. So growing. So it starts to get to where things start to look really wonky. That's maybe even more the case if we look at something like uh, this font, for instance. Look how tall and skinny that looks, but then it's got these really fat, thick strokes that go horizontally. So just, you know, in general, it's a bad idea to manipulate your type this way. Really a bad idea with that. Other things that we've got here is, let's go to get something else. Let's get a different font. Let's go with impact, for instance. What I might do here is adjust the baseline. To do that, perhaps what I want to do is make my initial cap larger and then drop it on the baseline to add a little bit of added interest to that. So, this baseline shift allows you to manipulate just specific area type letter forms on the baseline here. Uh, and obviously you can also rotate type. Here we can take this type and make it all caps, for instance, or upper and lower, or I mean small caps. Uh, if that was the case, let's make this the same as that, and we can see how the small caps work. If you're doing something that you want to make this superscript, let's go ahead and select that, superscript or subscript, especially if you're doing notation or chemical equations, things like that, that's really handy there. Um, take that out for the time being. Let's go ahead and do this. We'll get back to this here. Um, we also have underline. This is a bad idea too. Underline is a vestige of back when we used typewriters. We don't use typewriters really anymore, but on a typewriter, you had no way of showing emphasis. So the only way to do that was to underline text. Well, we have all kinds of ways to show emphasis now. If we're using a font that has several variations, right? Regular, light, bold, italic. We can show emphasis by just changing something to bold or italic. We don't have to underline it. The problem with underline is what happens is you get the bizarre thing that starts to cut through your descenders here. It just looks bad. It would be better if you wanted to use an underline. It would be better to go ahead and put your type there. I'm going to go zoom in here a little bit and perhaps put an actual line in. You move that down. I'll swap it here and then maybe cut it here, here. Because then I can work around things like the descenders and so on like that. So you it's very rare that you'll get a lot of use out of the underline. There are places, especially if you were doing something that was an all caps look here, you could do an underline pretty successfully. Let me take out this baseline shift. You could do an underline pretty successfully with all caps because the underline wouldn't be breaking through any descenders or anything like that. So that's a couple of things to keep in mind when you're working with that. Well, with this type, I just put the type out there and clicked and started to type. By default, the type is what's called left, uh, align left, or left justified, which means that this is a start spot, and then if we did a return, it would come back to that same spot here. We can also do type by clicking and dragging out. And then as we type, and let me select all this, take that out, and let's reduce the scale. It will auto return. Let me change this, we'll drag that down a little bit. All right. And let's go to, right. This kind of type usage is really handy, especially if you're doing columns of type and things like that for magazines or advertisements, or for instance, when you do the government label warning on the wine label, all you have to do is define that box, and then that government warning, you can just type it away and it'll fit inside that box. You may have to change the point size and stuff like that, but you can fit it inside that box. That is also handy if you want to do something like, let's go ahead and put type here, and I'm going to go ahead and change that to a force justified, and I can put the type out like that. If you want to do some kind of exaggerated spacing on your type, I'll put some bullets in there just for grins. Right. So if you want to do something like that, you may want to define the box and then force justify it. Obviously, we'll only work on one word at a time or something along those lines. Another thing to keep in mind too is when you do something like this, you only want to do that when you're doing all caps. This would look terrible if this was an upper and lowercase or a lowercase font. Um, and it's actually another sure sign of an amateur if you see somebody that's doing exaggerated spacing and they're doing it with upper and lowercase or all lowercase. This is just really something that you would only attempt if you were doing it with all caps. Okay, in the next video, I'm going to talk a little bit more about how you can manipulate the type on paths and even adapt the type to certain shapes and things like that.